The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days straight in the quiet town of Maplewood. Music. It was one of those endless storms that seemed to soak into people's hearts more than the ground beneath their feet. At a small coffee shop tucked away between old bookstores and florists, music. Emma Caldwell sat by the window, her trembling hands wrapped around a cup of lukewarm coffee she hadn't touched in an hour. Music. The reflection in the glass showed a woman of 38, tired eyes, faint lines around her mouth that once carried laughter, and a look of someone who had given too much of herself to people who never stayed. She had once been a teacher, passionate and kind, the sort who believed every child could change the world. But after her husband's betrayal 5 years ago, she had learned that some lessons were written not music and clear as throat in textbooks, but in heartbreak. Her son had gone off to college last month, and for the first time in nearly 2 decades, her small home felt empty. Silence had become her only company. That morning, as the rain tapped rhythmically on a window, she saw him for the first time. Music, Daniel Ross. He was standing outside, drenched, his hands stuffed in his jacket pockets, laughing softly as he helped an elderly woman cross the street. His laughter carried even through the glass, warm and effortless. Something about him, his boyish grin, the spark of kindness in his eyes, pulled her attention before she could stop herself. He looked younger, maybe 30, maybe less, when he stepped into the cafe, shaking water off his coat. She looked away quickly. She didn't realize then that one simple smile was about to change everything she thought she knew about love and age. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and love that defies the world's expectations, make sure to like, comment, music, share, and subscribe. Because what happens next will remind you that hearts don't care about numbers. They care about connection. Daniel ordered coffee and sat across from her. Not on purpose. It just happened. The cafe was nearly full, and he politely asked if the seat was taken. Music. She nodded, hesitant, trying not to notice how his presence seemed to warm the cold around her. They didn't speak for the first few minutes, but silence between them felt strangely comforting. He was reading something on his phone, and she found herself glancing up more than once, curious about the stranger who carried sunlight, even on a rainy day. When he finally looked up, their eyes met. He smiled, genuine, music unguarded, and said, "You look like someone who's waiting for a miracle." The word startled her, and for a moment she couldn't speak. It had been so long since anyone had noticed her in that way. Not as a mother, not as someone left behind, but as a woman. She managed a small laugh, saying she stopped believing in miracles years ago. He just smiled as if he didn't believe her. Days turned into weeks, and soon Emma realized that Daniel had become a quiet presence in her routine. Every morning around the same time, they'd end up at that same cafe. Sometimes they talked about books, about music, about little things that didn't matter, but somehow did. She learned that Daniel was a freelance photographer who traveled often, capturing stories of people who lived simple but extraordinary lives. Music. He had a way of seeing beauty where others saw nothing, and though he never said it outright, she could tell he saw something in her, too. Emma tried to ignore the flutter in music, her chest whenever he laughed. She reminded herself he was younger, that his world was wide and new, while hers was smaller and worn. She had responsibilities, scars, music memories, things that didn't belong in a young man's future. But Daniel's attention didn't fade. Instead, it deepened. He'd tell her she looked beautiful when she hadn't even combed her hair. He'd listen to her stories about teaching as if they were poetry. And slowly, against all logic, Emma began to feel alive again. Music. One evening, as the town's Christmas lights flickered across wet streets, Daniel invited her to a small gallery, music, where his photographs were on display. She hesitated, but curiosity won. The photos were breathtaking. Music, children smiling in remote villages, old couples holding hands, sunsets that looked like they'd been painted by God himself. Music, but one picture stopped her heart. It was of her sitting by the cafe window, lost in thought. Music, rain streaking down the glass. Daniel stood behind her quietly. "You look like someone remembering how to dream," he said softly. She, music, turned, unable to hide the tremor in her voice. "You shouldn't have taken that." But he just smiled. "I couldn't help it. You were the only real thing in that room. That night when he walked her home, music, she felt something she hadn't in years. A warmth that wasn't just comfort, but hope. At her doorstep, he looked at her for a long time, as if memorizing her face. You music, know I'm older than you, she said suddenly, her voice breaking the tender silence. She meant it as a warning, a wall to protect herself. He didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled with that gentle confidence that had always disarmed her. My heart doesn't count years, he whispered. It just knows when it's home. Emma felt her world tilt. She wanted to tell him it couldn't work, that love didn't erase years or expectations. But his sincerity made it impossible to speak. In his eyes, she saw something purer than youth, devotion. Still, doubts clawed at her. The next morning, she avoided the cafe. Days passed. Music. Daniel sent her photos, little glimpses of beauty from his travels. But she didn't reply. She told herself it was for his sake. Music. That she didn't want to become a regret in his story. But loneliness has a way of finding cracks in the strongest walls. One rainy night, there was a knock on her door. When she opened it, Daniel stood there soaked to the bone. I've been looking for you, he music said. You disappeared. She tried to stay firm, telling him it was for the best, that she couldn't give him what he deserved. But he shook music his head. You don't get to decide what I deserve. You taught me that love isn't measured by age. It's measured by how deeply we care. His voice broke raw with emotion. And I care about you, Emma. Tears blurred her vision as she whispered, people will talk. He smiled faintly. Let them talk about a woman who made me believe in love again. That was the night Emma finally let her heart win over her fear. They stood under the rain, the world fading into the sound of thunder and heartbeat. When Daniel kissed her, it wasn't the reckless passion of youth. It was a quiet promise of someone who had found something worth keeping. Months passed, and slowly the whispers died. People saw them together at the farmer's market, at the lake, sometimes walking hand in hand through the streets of Maplewood. Music. The town learned to accept what Emma had finally learned to believe. Music. That love doesn't come with a time stamp. One afternoon, Emma stood by the lake as Daniel set up his camera for another project. The sunlight caught in her hair, and for the first time in years, she felt beautiful without trying. Daniel glanced at her, his eyes soft. You still think I'm too young for you? She smiled, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. No, I think I was too afraid to see what was right in front of me. They built a life together, slow and steady. There were challenges. There always are. But the foundation of their love was stronger than doubt. He supported her when she went back to teaching. She cheered him on when his photography gained recognition. They didn't chase grand gestures. They found joy in everyday kindness, in the small miracles that others overlooked. Years later, when Emma turned 45, Daniel surprised her with a small exhibition dedicated entirely to her. The title read, The Woman Who Made Me See Time Differently. Music. Visitors wandered through the gallery, gazing at portraits of her, laughing, thinking, living. But for Daniel, those weren't just photos. They were proof that love had rewritten his story. As the evening ended, Emma leaned against him, whispering, You know, I was terrified the first time you told me you loved me. He chuckled softly. And music now, she smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. Now I realize love isn't about how long you've lived. It's about how deeply you've been seen. The rain started again outside, soft music, and steady. The same kind that had brought them together years ago. Daniel took her hand, kissed music, her knuckles gently, and said, Then I guess I'll spend the rest of my life seeing you. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that love has no age, music, no boundary, please share and subscribe. Let kindness, courage, and second music. Chances keep spreading through stories like this. Special request. Tell us in the comments. Music. Have you ever loved someone the world said you shouldn't? Because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply to follow your